Welcome to the IWP podcast, coming to you live from the Institute of World Politics in Washington, D.C. I'm Jim Robbins, Dean of Academics at IWP, an accredited graduate school of national security, intelligence, and international affairs, offering a variety of certificates, master's degrees, and doctorates, both in person and online. You can check out our programs and our courses at our website, iwp.edu. Okay, today I want to talk about why you should always believe the bad guys. So over the weekend, Death to America was trending on X. In fact, it was on the list for several days. This was because of a video of pro-Palestinian protesters chanting Death to America and Death to Israel at an Al-Quds Day rally in Dearborn, Michigan. Speaker Tarek Bazzi denounced our country because of funding for the atrocities in the Gaza Strip. He said, "This is why Imam Khomeini, who declared the International Al-Quds Day, this is why he would say to pour all of your chants and all of your shouts upon the head of America." Then he quoted Malcolm X, saying, "We live in one of the rottenest countries that has ever existed on earth. It's not Genocide Joe that has to go, it's the entire system that has to go. Any system that would allow such atrocities and delivery to happen and would support it, such a system does not deserve to exist on God's earth." Bazzi has made more specific comments about the need for bloodshed and violence in the past. This time he restrained himself. Okay, so this guy really hates America, the country that took him in, gave him freedoms and opportunities he could never enjoy in his homeland. He thinks the entire system has to go, presumably the Constitution included. Bazzi struck a nerve and his comments went viral. But anybody can rave against the system. Do we have to take someone like this seriously? Well, we should at least take him as seriously as he takes himself. If you don't, you have to ask yourself why not. Because he's irrelevant, because he can't make a difference, can't put his plans into practice? Maybe not, but what if he tried? There's a tendency amongst Western intellectuals to explain away the radical thought and behavior that comes from left-wing or developing world extremist groups, saying it is only symbolic or only for propaganda or just to keep their followers happy. And that is dangerous. There was a fantastic article by Shlomi Eldar in the April 5th Haaretz entitled, "Hamas Actually Believed It Would Conquer Israel." The author spoke to Gazans in exile in Egypt, in particular examining questions like, what did Hamas think it was doing? And uncovering the motivations, plans, and visions of the terrorists. To me, this has always been one of the more interesting questions when dealing with violent extremists, or any kind of radicals. What are they thinking? What are they saying? And do they believe it? With Hamas, they really did believe that they were on the verge of defeating Israel. The author spoke to Abu Zaida, a Gazan moderate who was on reasonable terms with the Hamas leaders. Zaida said, "It was hard for us to grasp that they believed that the 3,000, 5,000, or even 10,000 armed militants would conquer Israel. That's insane. But when you believe that God is sending you to do his bidding, there's no one to argue with. The signs were out there the whole time." Since 2021, Hamas leaders have been talking about implementing the last promise, a divine promise regarding the end of days, when all human beings will accept Islam. In 2021, Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar declared, "We must be ready to defend Al-Aqsa. Our whole nation needs to be ready to march in a raging flood in order to uproot this occupation from our land." And recall that the October 7th massacre was codenamed Operation Al-Aqsa Flood. The topic of post-Israel Palestine was discussed on September 30th of that year at the Promise of the Hereafter Post-Liberation Palestine Conference held at the Commodore Hotel on the Mediterranean coast. This was sponsored by Sinwar and attended by senior officials from Hamas and other Palestinian factions. They discussed preparations for the future administration of the State of Palestine following its liberation from Israel, which will disappear. Information on this conference can be found at the Middle East Media Research Institute, or MEMRI, website. The planning was very detailed, dealing with issues of governance, transfer of authority at the UN level, what to do with Jews still in Palestine, how to handle currency, the return of Palestinian refugees, property rights, resource rights, all kinds of practical details. Sinwar said this was necessary because the conquest of Israel would come soon. Conference chairman Kenan Obeid said, "The liberation will come within a few years." And yes, 2 years and 1 week later. Incidentally, Obeid is currently in Israeli custody. The Haaretz article says, "The group's madness was apparent to many. In fact, anyone who watched the Hamas television channel, heard Sinwar's speeches, or followed his colleagues on Twitter could have understood that a process was underway in Gaza of preparing people for a large-scale military operation. Yet only a few realized that these were not just fantasies, but a concrete ambition that would be translated into a concrete plan." How concrete was it? Eldar spoke to another Gazan who was offered, in full sincerity, membership on the post-liberation town council in a town his family was from, which is currently inside Israel. The promise of the Hereafter Conference was covered in the media. The AP even noted it. But terrorists say a lot of crazy things like this, so it's easy to ignore it. The Israelis knew about it but didn't believe it. Their intelligence failure was not lack of facts, but an analytical framework that assumed Hamas was mellowing. But that's what Hamas wanted them to think. And this despite the fact that the promise of the Hereafter Conference was the first public planning meeting for what became the October 7th massacre. The vision for October 7th was not to attack and retreat into Gaza to fight from the tunnels in guerrilla fashion. It was to attack and keep going, to inspire a massive popular uprising, to extend the flood all the way to Jerusalem, and to prevail. They thought they could win. That was what they were talking about and actively planning for. It didn't work out that way, of course. But how did the Israelis miss this? At IWP, we like to talk about the impediments to seeing reality, like mirror imaging, willful blindness, ideology, and so forth. Things that prevent you from seeing things the way they really are. But unless you truly are committed to seeing reality and overcoming the impediments, you can't be a good analyst, you can't be a good strategist, you can't understand adversary countries or movements and what they are doing. Reality may not comport with your view of what the world is, or your vision of what a good world should be, but you have to be able to face it regardless. So how do you overcome the impediments and find what's real? Fortunately, the bad guys will help you with this, if you're willing to listen. Hannah Arendt, in her classic book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, observed that the propaganda of totalitarian movements is invariably as frank as it is mendacious. Totalitarian leaders usually start their careers by boasting of their past crimes and carefully outlining their future ones. Dictators like Hitler, Stalin, Mao, or Mussolini never made a secret of their expansive goals. And they didn't have to lie, since so many people in more reasonable countries refused to accept the truth and what it implied. Anyone who was surprised by the Holocaust had not been paying attention, or was simply not willing to accept it. In January 1944, and note that date, before D-Day, before the footage of the camps being liberated, the New York Times Magazine published an essay by Arthur Koestler entitled On Disbelieving Atrocities. It conveyed his frustration at trying to communicate what he and others had seen taking place in Nazi-dominated Europe. The events that came to be known as the Holocaust were starting to be known, but they were not widely accepted as true. Koestler blamed human psychology, an entrenched unwillingness to accept that something so heinous could simply not be real. This is one of the impediments. But the Nazis had been very honest about what they planned. They said they would conquer Europe and destroy Judaism, and they set about trying to do both. Likewise, Khmer Rouge military leader Khieu Samphan's 1959 doctoral thesis identified the urban bourgeoisie as a parasite class that had to be, quote, removed to the countryside. When Pol Pot took power in Cambodia 16 years later, this thesis formed the blueprint for the killing fields. So it's all just crazy talk until it isn't, until talk becomes action. It seems like the Israelis fell for the idea that Hamas was moderating its ways, that they were being educated, that despite their rhetoric, despite their repeated attacks, despite everything that they were doing, in fact, they were giving up on their revolutionary aims. You frequently see this when people talk about extremist groups, that somehow there's a moderate faction that needs to be encouraged, and that this would ultimately lead to peace, or at least some form of accommodation. Remember in 2021 when the Taliban swept back into power in Kabul, and there was all this reporting that this time it would be different, that there were moderates in the Taliban now, that they would not impose the same type of brutal Sharia-based law that they had in the 1990s. Remember those reports? Well, it didn't happen. You frequently hear this about Iran, that somehow there are Iranian moderates that need to be encouraged. This is not true either. During the Cold War with the Soviet Union, there was always the search for the moderate faction that never materialized. Terrorists don't like the moderates. If a faction of reasonable people is gaining power in their movement, they just kill them. So the entire thing is based on self-deception, a vain hope, a wish that things will get better. But things don't. Look at any of the radical Islamist movements, Hamas included. Their ideal world seems bizarre to people accustomed to the benefits of freedom. Why would anyone want to live that way, in a society without choice, without dissent, without art, music, or literature, in which women are chattel, prayers are compulsory, and theocratic dogma the only law? The idea seems so otherworldly, so inhumane and regressive, that some are tempted not to believe it. Surely, they argue, this is for internal consumption in their movement. Surely, this is only to motivate their extremist followers. A society that backward and bizarre cannot be the true objective of their movement. But not everybody in the world holds that the same truths are self-evident. When Iran says death to America, yes, they mean it. They hate the great Satan. Israel is just the little Satan. They would take us down if they could. And it would be easy enough to ignore Tarek Bazi in Dearborn, Michigan, quoting Khomeini and Malcolm X, and calling for the destruction of the American system. But he speaks for a lot of people in this country. People who don't buy into the great American civic myth. People who agree with Bazi that this is one of the rottenest countries that has ever existed on this earth. Or as Osama bin Laden said, the worst civilization witnessed by the history of mankind. There are people who see America as fatally compromised by the sin of slavery or racial injustice or class exploitation, or, as the Islamists think, simply having too much freedom. So it is important to take people like Bazi seriously because he takes himself seriously. He and others like him may be inspired by Hamas and seek to operationalize their disgust with our freedoms and find ways to attack them. You can't just dismiss it because you don't think it's reasonable. Someday they will try to put into practice what they believe, and which they told you they were going to do. So what if what they are saying is totally unrealistic? They don't think so. This is why Western countries are continually surprised by the extremists, because the extremist imagination is more powerful than Western skepticism. Thanks for tuning in. If you like this podcast, please share and subscribe. For IWP, I'm Jim Robbins. Join us next week for another edition of the IWP Podcast.